We continue the nationwide telethon on channel 1+1. This is our slot. And today we have...
Yes, I've already announced our next guest. Joining us is the former commander of the U.S. Army in Europe, Mr. Ben Hodges. Mr. Hodges, greetings to you. Thank you for joining our conversation.
Thank you for the privilege. Thank you for this opportunity.
The first event that the whole world has probably been watching for several weeks. On the eve of Russia's main religious holiday, Victory Day, there are hysterical statements, movements, cancellations of journalist accreditations, calls to Trump, and so on. What is happening, and what do you, in fact, expect from this weekend?
Well, I think the fear that the Kremlin feels regarding what might happen over Moscow on this date, it's a powerful signal of success, a signal of the success that Ukraine has achieved. The very idea of having a parade, the very idea of holding a parade with this fear of an attack, with this fear of some attack in the center of Moscow is already a shocking result for the Russians living there. This is a war. This is a war that has come home to them like never before.
Tell me, please, you voiced an interesting version that the lack of equipment at the parade is not a shortage, but a deceptive maneuver to hide reserves for an offensive from Belarus. Do you believe that the Russian Federation can now form a strike group there?
Well, certainly that's a possibility. The possibility of this cannot be ruled out. I don't assume, actually, that the tanks available, the reason the tanks are not being brought to Red Square is simply because, after all, they would be destroyed there. But I do think it's likely, but I really think that likely they are being mothballed or somewhere there, maybe stored perhaps for deployment even to Belarus. I think the general staff of Ukraine is considering this and understands that such a possibility exists. And I'm confident that they are doing what they need to determine. And in fact, they are doing, I think, everything possible to determine if something is really happening in the Belarusian direction. Maybe there's no tanks. Maybe there are no tanks after all, simply because they just aren't there. I trust the Ukrainian General Staff. I think because of what the Ukrainian General Staff is doing.
General, how would you characterize several processes together? First, the withdrawal from negotiations, as the Russians said, until the capture of the entire Luhansk and Donetsk regions by the Russian Federation. Second, the withdrawal of the United States from the negotiation process. Supposedly, they won't participate where they are ineffective. And third, the Europeans have declared their interest in the negotiation process and are already preparing proposals. Could you please characterize what all of this might mean together?
Well, I think that now, finally, the time has at last come for Ukraine. For Ukraine, not to assume that the only hope for a negotiated outcome is the United States. And I'm very disappointed that my country, my president, actually have taken an approach that I would call pro-Kremlin. The negotiation team, led by Mr. Witkoff and Mr. Kushner, never even made it to Kyiv. And I don't know how much leverage the United States actually has. I think President Zelensky and his team see this, and I honestly think that they will, after carefully considering everything, make the very best decision possible about who offers the greatest chance for the best possible outcome. And that includes anyone else who offers to help lead the negotiations. To me, it's abundantly clear that Vladimir Putin truly has no interest in negotiations unless he is forced to. Right now, it truly feels as though Ukraine currently has the momentum and can clearly demand negotiations from a position of strength.
Tell me, please, recently, at Russia's initiative, a conversation took place between Lavrov and Marco Rubio. And European media began to write that this is obviously a flanking maneuver by the Kremlin, an attempt to bypass the current administration and reach the Republican wing of the US. How much do you believe such a diplomatic flanking maneuver can help Russia, and does it threaten Ukraine in any way?
Unfortunately, at this moment, I have no confidence that the Republican leadership in Congress is going to do anything contrary to what President Trump wants. And so even if Republicans in Congress support Ukraine, or like Senator Graham, who has talked about support packages, about supporting Ukraine, actually they don't want to do anything on their own. They're waiting for a signal from Trump. And this, I'll say it again, is a sad situation. They've essentially abdicated these powers granted by the Constitution. I can't explain why it's happening this way. It seems they just don't want to. Cross the president. Maybe after the November elections, we'll see a change in congressional leadership. Maybe the Democrats will win back at least part of Congress. Maybe before that, this will lead to some changes. Until then, I don't see the Republican Congress changing its position at all. You know, a couple of days ago, my attention was caught when President Trump spoke about Ukraine. His very tone has changed. It seems he finally realized that the war is turning out very badly for Russia in many respects, and it seems that the advantage is currently on Ukraine's side. Is this perhaps the first time? I have heard from him. He spoke about Ukraine, the aid efforts, and Ukraine's own efforts. Maybe he is actually able to really read the tea leaves regarding the prospects for Ukraine. Maybe this will somehow embolden the Republicans in Congress to do more.
General, but returning to the Russian Federation's statement that it won't participate in negotiations until Ukraine gives them all the territory of Luhansk and Donetsk. Tell us, please, maybe you see what the Russian Federation is counting on by continuing the war. Does the Russian Federation have some secret trump cards?
I don't see any positive outcome at all for Ukraine if Russia is allowed to keep any part of the Donbas region. I don't see that as a positive outcome. The same applies to Crimea. I don't see any advantages for Ukraine if Russia is allowed to keep Crimea as a result of any negotiations, as long as they continue to occupy Crimea. Ukraine will never have access to the Sea of Azov, nor will there be any hope of returning. Berdyansk, Mariupol, productive Ukrainian ports. That would have to be given up. Russia will always have the ability to potentially launch some kind of new military attacks from the side of Crimea, on Odessa, other ports, Ukrainian ones in the Black Sea. So wherever the negotiations go right now, I think that the long-term goal will always be the full restoration of Ukrainian sovereign borders, including Crimea. Maybe it won't happen all at once. Maybe it will take some time for that. But the only way to truly achieve lasting and genuine long-term security and certainty is to defeat Russia and to return it to the borders of 1991.
We still come back to the fact that the main cards, which politicians love to talk about, are dealt by the defense forces of Ukraine. So I want to ask for your military expertise on what has been happening on the front these 5 months. Because we in Ukraine are now focused on two important things. First, for 5 months now, we've been destroying more occupiers than they are mobilizing. And our military from Azov stated that through their drone sites, they finally saw Mariupol.
The war has changed in favor of Ukraine, I think, because it's the result of very focused efforts by Ukrainian defenders, leaders, and indeed they have increased the number of killed and wounded on the Russian side, and they are losing more than they can replace. This is a negative trend for the Russian side. They will have to do something to increase the number of recruits. This will likely mean full mobilization, including in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And I don't think that's what they actually want. So I think a very positive approach is what Ukraine has chosen. And if we talk about the transition to the strategic destruction of oil and gas infrastructure in Russia, specifically by making use of long-range weapons, then this, will make it very difficult for Russia to continue the war even into next year. I would say that Ukraine has managed, thanks to the innovative use of drones, thanks to the increased capacity of the Ukrainian defense industry, first of all, to stop Russia's ground operations, to destroy the Russian oil and gas infrastructure. And this, in fact, is already such a vector towards victory if Ukraine can maintain this pace. Of course, the West must help it in this by stopping Shadow Fleet vessels and limiting access to the Black and Baltic Seas for the Russians.
General, and again, continuing this conversation about the dynamics of the war and how everything has changed during it, I'd like to get your expertise. Look here. The war began when it was actually fought with human resources. Then, from those battles, the war moved to a war of Leopards and Bradleys. But later, the war turned into combat operations using drones and ground-based robotic systems. Tell me, please, the next stage of the war, how do you see it?
What a great question, actually. Every war goes through evolutions. When both sides gradually adapt to each other, applying new technologies and new capabilities as they go along, that emerge. The will and desire of both sides also changes. To continue the war, logistics is put to the test. I think we'll increasingly see more and more long-range strikes by the Ukrainian armed forces against targeted Russian oil and gas infrastructure, against the Shadow Fleet. I think more and more vessels carrying Russian oil will be hit. I think the factories that are currently producing critical components for the Russians, for their missiles and drones, will increasingly become targets for attack as Ukraine increases its capacity to produce such weapons in sufficiently large quantities. I'm not ready to predict some kind of new phase of the conflict. But, I'm just waiting right now, and I really want to see what actually happens to the Russians' will to fight soon. Will the Russian troops finally break under all this pressure, or will they somehow manage to hold on? As for that circle around Vladimir Putin, I want to see if they'll keep supporting him or say, enough is enough. I would imagine the Ukrainian General Staff is also considering this, thinking about it and thinking about how to accelerate the collapse of Russian forces. And the Ukrainian General Staff is preparing to take advantage of such opportunities. I can't say exactly when that will happen, but I think we need to be ready to exploit any cracks, any signs of collapse within the Russian forces so that it then gains momentum like a snowball.
We're already tired of waiting for that. And there's one very important issue where Ukraine still relies entirely on the United States. That's interceptor missiles for the Patriot systems. We need something to intercept ballistic missiles. Do you see a willingness from the United States, even using European funds, to consistently provide Ukraine with enough PAC-2 and PAC-3 interceptor missiles? Or do you believe that in the near future, Ukraine and Europe will be able to develop their own genuine anti-ballistic capabilities?
This is a very important point. This is one of those areas where, in my view, Ukraine doesn't yet have the capacity to fully stop Russia. Even though the Ukrainian armed forces are shooting down the majority of Russian missiles and drones, quite a few still get through, killing innocent Ukrainians on a weekly basis. This happens during these attacks. And you really want to see something change here to take some of the pressure off the citizens of Ukraine and its energy infrastructure. From this pressure, I don't see any signs of a significant increase in the volume of supplies, whether it's Patriot missiles or other systems for Ukraine. I don't see this happening either directly or indirectly. Primarily because the conflict involving Iran has consumed a lot of resources, and it will take time to replenish those stocks. I'd love to be wrong, but I don't see the U.S. providing any large-scale deliveries. I'm not sure how much Ukraine can do on its own, but I think that working with European nations, they can help fill this gap with anti-drone systems and air defense capabilities. In fact, European countries do have some of these capabilities. There just aren't enough of them. So finding a way to ramp up their production, so to speak, and the capacity of existing weaponry, that could be part of the solution. When it comes to air defense, I'm a firm believer. Sure. You know, it is better to kill the archer than it is to try to shoot down every single arrow. The more that Ukraine can do to destroy Russia's capability to manufacture missiles and drones to kill their archer before he is able to launch that arrow against Ukraine, that has to be the main focus.
Thank you, General. Thank you. Ben Hodges, former commander of the United States Army in Europe, was on the air of the National Telethon. We are very grateful to him for that.